August 1944. The beaches of Normandy had been held. The German lines in France were cracking. The liberation of Western Europe was no longer a gamble. It was a matter of time and logistics. The war was being won. And in a series of meetings so tense, so exhausting, so emotionally raw that Eisenhower's own aide described him as practically limp afterward, the supreme commander of the Allied forces had to look the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the eye. A man he admired, a man who had kept civilization alive when almost no one else would, and say no, again, and again, and again. Winston Churchill, one of the most eloquent human beings who ever lived, a man who had moved parliaments and rallied nations with the sheer force of his words, tried everything he had: arguments, cables, threats, emotion. He told Eisenhower he would go to the king himself and lay down the highest office in the British Empire rather than accept what was about to happen. Eisenhower said no anyway. Churchill had been dragooned, his word, bitter and deliberate, into an operation he believed was one of the worst strategic mistakes of the war. And the story of how that happened, and why Eisenhower held the line despite everything Churchill threw at him, and whether history proved either man right, is one of the most consequential and least told confrontations of the entire Second World War. If this is the kind of history you want, the fights that happened in rooms, the decisions behind the battles, the moments where personality and strategy collided and changed the course of the world, subscribe right now. We do this every decade, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from: London, Louisiana, wherever you are. This history belongs to all of us. To understand what Churchill was fighting against, you have to go back to December 1943, Tehran, Iran. The first and only time Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sat in the same room together. It was a meeting that shifted the weight of the entire alliance. Stalin wanted one thing above everything else: a massive Allied invasion of northwestern France. A true second front that would force Germany to split its armies and bleed in two directions simultaneously. He had been asking for it for 2 years. He had watched the Soviet Union absorb catastrophic losses, millions dead, while the Western Allies fought in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, campaigns Churchill had championed and which Stalin regarded with barely concealed suspicion. At Tehran, Stalin got his answer. Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France, was confirmed for the spring of 1944, and it would be accompanied by a second operation, an amphibious assault on the south of France, near Marseille. The two invasions together would function like a vice, Overlord hammering in from the north. This second operation, initially called Anvil, pressing up from the Mediterranean. Germany, caught between them, would be crushed. Churchill agreed to this. He signed on at Tehran. But Churchill had a quality that drove the Americans quietly mad. He never considered any decision, once made, to be truly final until it was physically executed. No agreement, in his view, was beyond further discussion. The world changed. Circumstances shifted. Surely a brilliant man could always find a better way. And Churchill had a different vision for how to end this war. A vision rooted not just in military logic, but in politics, in history, in what Europe would look like in 1950 and 1960, once the guns stopped. Churchill's alternative was not a retreat or a defensive posture. It was aggressive, ambitious, and in its own way, visionary. Forget southern France, he argued. Pour those resources, those 7 elite divisions, those landing craft, that irreplaceable momentum, into Italy. Push past the German lines, drive through the Ljubljana Gap, that narrow mountain corridor in Yugoslavia, into Austria and Hungary. Get there before the Red Army. Churchill had watched Stalin at Tehran. He had sat in the same room with the Soviet leader and seen something that disturbed him deeply. The Red Army was advancing westward with enormous force. If it kept moving, if nothing stopped it, Soviet power would fill the vacuum left by the collapsing Third Reich. Central Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, would fall under Moscow's shadow before the Western Allies could do anything about it. The Italian campaign, in Churchill's strategic imagination, was not a sideshow. It was the key that unlocked Central Europe. It was the one path by which the Western democracies could get there first. This was not a foolish idea. Military historians have argued about it ever since. Some believe Churchill was right, and that the decision to pull 7 divisions out of Italy for the southern France operation, stripping General Harold Alexander's army of its striking power at precisely the moment it might have broken through, was a tragic missed opportunity that handed Stalin Eastern Europe on a plate. But this is not 1960 looking backward. This is August 1944 looking forward. And to Eisenhower's American commanders, to General George Marshall, to Roosevelt himself, Churchill's Balkan strategy looked like something else entirely. It looked like a British Prime Minister trying to use American troops to defend British imperial interests in the Mediterranean. It looked like another delay, another diversion, another reason not to go straight at Germany and finish the war. They had been here before. Churchill had pushed for North Africa when the Americans wanted to cross the Channel. He had pushed for Sicily. He had pushed for Italy. Each time, the Americans had accepted the argument, and each time, in their view, the war in Europe had been prolonged while Germany fortified its western defenses and the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting. "Not again," said Marshall. "Not again," said Roosevelt. The plan agreed at Tehran would be honored. Churchill did not give up. Churchill never gave up. Through the spring and summer of 1944, even as Overlord was being planned, even after D-Day on June 6 when the Normandy beachhead was established, Churchill kept fighting. He wrote cables. He called meetings. He worked on Roosevelt with the full force of his eloquence, painting a picture of the post-war world in which the failure to push into Central Europe would haunt the democracies for generations. Roosevelt's reply, when it came, was not long. Roosevelt backed his military chiefs. Operation Anvil, the southern France invasion, would proceed. And then Roosevelt did something that stunned Churchill. He delegated the matter to Eisenhower. Churchill's persistence had worn the president thin. The decision had been made at the highest levels of the alliance. If the prime minister wished to continue arguing the case, he could argue it to the supreme commander. This was, in retrospect, a calculated move. It placed Churchill in an extraordinary position. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, the man who had stood alone against Hitler when America was still neutral, the man whose relationship with Roosevelt was the linchpin of the entire Western alliance, was now being told to make his case to an American general. Churchill found this humiliating. He also found it unavoidable. The confrontations happened in early August 1944. The invasion of southern France was now days away. The ships were loading. The troops were staging. The date was set for August 15th, and Churchill was still trying to stop it. He proposed a last-minute alternative. What if the forces earmarked for southern France landed instead on the coast of Brittany, in the north, or at a port further west? Anything but the Mediterranean. Anything to keep those 7 divisions within reach of the Italian campaign and the road to the east. Eisenhower heard the arguments. He had heard them many times before, because this dispute had been running for months. He was not dismissive of Churchill. He never was. He understood the political dimensions of what the Prime Minister was raising. He genuinely respected the man. But he also understood something that Churchill's position, in Eisenhower's judgment, ignored. The problem was supply. It was unglamorous. It was logistical. It was the kind of thing that did not make for stirring speeches. But it was, in the summer of 1944, potentially the thing that would determine whether the liberation of Europe succeeded or stalled. The Normandy ports were not enough. Simple, blunt, unarguable fact. The Allied armies pouring through the breach in France were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, mountains of ammunition, fuel, food, medicine. The ports in Normandy and Brittany could not handle the volume. They were choked, and without throughput, without the ability to get supplies ashore in quantities sufficient to sustain the advance, the momentum that had been bought with the blood of June 6th would bleed out. Marseille was one of the finest ports in the Mediterranean. It had the infrastructure, the capacity, the geographic position to serve as a second great artery for the Allied war machine. Capturing it was not an adventure. It was not an imperial project. It was a logistical necessity for the army that was supposed to drive into Germany and end the war. Eisenhower had made this case to Churchill. He made it again. He said no to Brittany. He said no to the alternatives. He said no in what his aide Harry Butcher would later record as every form of the English language at his command. Churchill, Butcher noted, left that meeting, the one on August 9th, having gotten nothing, and Eisenhower was practically limp from the effort of holding the line. Here is the moment that the title of this video refers to, and it requires a word of care. Churchill was a man of enormous emotion. This is documented extensively by everyone who knew him. He cried at military parades. He cried at great speeches. He cried when friends died, when the bombing started, when old songs were sung. He was, in the words of one scholar, a Regency figure born out of his time, a man of such powerful feeling that if he felt like crying, he simply did, without embarrassment, without apology. During these August meetings, Eisenhower later described Churchill as stirred, upset, and even despondent. That is a significant description. This was not the Churchill of, "We shall fight on the beaches." This was a man in genuine anguish, watching what he believed was a catastrophic strategic error unfold in real time, and finding himself powerless to stop it. Churchill also made what was, even by his own standards, an extraordinary statement. He told Eisenhower, the general, the subordinate, the man from Kansas who had been given command of the greatest military operation in history, that if this invasion went ahead, he would have no choice but to go to His Majesty the King and lay down the mantle of his high office. He was threatening to resign. The Prime Minister of Britain was telling the Supreme Allied Commander that this decision might end his government. Eisenhower heard it. He had spent 4 years learning to distinguish between Churchillian rhetoric, which could fill a room and shake the walls, and genuine intent. He knew, as he later reflected, that Churchill fought hard against things he opposed, and that some of those fights came wrapped in dramatic language that was more emotional than operational. He said no. He said no because the supply situation was real. He said no because the commitment to the operation went back to Tehran and had been confirmed by Roosevelt. He said no because the ships were loaded, the troops were ready, and canceling now would be an act of chaos that would benefit no one except Germany. And he said no, perhaps most importantly, because he believed it was right. The resignation threat, in Eisenhower's judgment, was not delivered. Churchill did not go to the king. He absorbed the outcome. He accepted the answer, and he lived with it, unhappily, for years. On August 15, 1944, Allied forces landed on the coast of Provence in southern France. American Sixth Corps under General Lucien Truscott came ashore between Toulon and Caen. 9,000 paratroopers had dropped inland the night before, securing critical crossroads and disrupting German communications. The French resistance rose up across the region. The German defense was, compared to Normandy, negligible. The German 19th Army had been stripped of its best units throughout the summer, its armor siphoned northward to fight the Normandy breakout. What remained was understrength, demoralized, and stretched impossibly thin along a coastline far too long to defend with what they had. By nightfall of the first day, all 3 American divisions had secured their beachheads. Casualties were under 500 men. One American cartoonist who covered the war called it the best invasion I ever attended. Hitler reportedly called August 15th the worst day of his life. What followed was a pursuit, not a battle. French forces under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny swept into Toulon and Marseille with remarkable speed. Toulon fell on August 21st. Marseille fell on the 27th. Both cities were liberated within 12 days of the landings, ahead of schedule, with less resistance than anyone had predicted. The German 19th Army, which should have been able to hold or at least conduct an orderly retreat, was shattered. It fled north up the Rhone Valley, harassed constantly by Allied air power and the French resistance, hemorrhaging men and equipment it could not replace. By September 11, 1944, less than 4 weeks after the landings, forces from Operation Dragoon had linked up with General George Patton's Third Army, which had broken out of Normandy and was racing east. The pocket was closed. Southern France was free. And Marseille, the port that Churchill had called unnecessary, that he had argued was too far away to matter, that he had spent months fighting to keep out of the invasion plan, was open for business. Within weeks, It was receiving supplies at a rate that transformed the Allied ability to sustain the advance into Germany. Churchill had said it wouldn't help Eisenhower. The port of Marseille alone proved him wrong. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Because Churchill was not entirely wrong. He was wrong about the military value of the southern France operation in the narrow sense. Wrong about whether it would help Eisenhower. Wrong about Marseille. Wrong about the German resistance. The operation was a resounding success by any military metric. But Churchill's deeper argument, the geopolitical one, the one about what would happen to Central Europe when the war ended, deserves to be taken seriously. General Mark Clark, the American commander in Italy, would later call Operation Dragoon the outstanding political mistake of the war. He believed, as Churchill did, that the Italian campaign, properly resourced, could have pushed into Austria and Hungary and gotten there before the Red Army. Whether that was actually possible, whether the Alps and the German defenders of the Gothic Line would have permitted it, military historians still debate. The mountains were formidable. German resistance in Italy was tenacious. The Ljubljana Gap was one mountain pass, and one pass can be blocked. Sir Michael Howard, one of the most respected British military historians of the 20th century, was skeptical that the Italian campaign could have delivered Central Europe even with those 7 divisions retained. What is not debatable is that by 1945, the map of Europe looked exactly as Churchill had feared. Poland was gone. Czechoslovakia was gone. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, gone. An iron curtain descended across the continent, and it sat precisely where Churchill, with what turned out to be extraordinary foresight, had predicted it would sit if the Western Allies did not move fast enough. He had fought to move fast enough. He had lost the argument, and he spent the rest of his life living with what that meant. Churchill watched the landings from the deck of a British destroyer. He had not stopped opposing the operation even in those final days. He had kept arguing, kept proposing alternatives, kept trying to find a way to redirect those troops. But once the decision was made, once the ships had sailed and the question was settled, he did what he always did. He went to see it. He stood on that deck and watched the beach. He was not a man who sulked at a distance from events. He had to be there. He had to see it. And in that, even in defeat, there was something admirable. Years later, as late as 1948, he was still writing to Eisenhower about it. He told the general, in a private letter, that he did not believe Dragoon had helped him at Normandy, and that Anvil had weakened Alexander's army without delivering the strategic result its designers intended. He was still arguing the case, still convinced. Eisenhower, for his part, disagreed. He had seen what the port of Marseille delivered. He had watched the German 19th Army collapse. He had received, in September 1944, the junction with Patton's forces that confirmed the Southern campaign had been fully integrated into the larger liberation of France. He believed he had been right. Both men were right about something. Eisenhower was right about the military operation. Churchill was right about the political consequences. History, in its uncomfortable way, gave each of them exactly enough to feel justified and not quite enough to feel vindicated. What does this story actually tell us? It tells us something about the nature of alliances. Churchill and Eisenhower were genuine friends. They admired each other. They worked together for years under pressures that would have broken most relationships. And yet on this question, this single question of where to put 7 divisions in August 1944, they could not find each other. Because they were not, in the end, arguing about military strategy alone. They were arguing about something deeper. Churchill was arguing about empire, about Britain's place in the post-war world, about the thing that had driven him through every year of the war, the survival not just of Britain's territory, but of Britain's power and its future influence. He had watched America grow stronger every month, had watched the center of gravity in the alliance shift steadily westward, had understood with increasing clarity that the war he was winning was also a war his country, in some fundamental sense, was losing its global position, losing its ability to shape the peace, losing the world that had made Britain great. Operation Dragoon was, in that context, one battle in a larger contest Churchill was already on the wrong side of. And Eisenhower was arguing about something equally simple and equally profound. He was arguing about winning. Not the peace, not the post-war map. Winning the war. Right now, with the tools he had, in the time he had. His soldiers were in the field. His supply lines were straining. He needed Marseille. He took it. Churchill later said that up until July 1944, Britain had considerable say in the direction of the war. After that, he was increasingly conscious that it was America that made the big decisions. He could have marked that moment earlier. He could have marked it in those tense August meetings when he argued with everything he had, with his rhetoric, with his emotion, with a threat to resign that even he must have known would not be delivered. And a general from Kansas who had never led troops in combat before this war looked back at him and kept saying no. On September 11, 1944, troops from the south of France shook hands with troops from the north. The whole of France was now in Allied hands, or Allied pursuit. The road to Germany was open. Churchill had watched it happen from that destroyer. He had accepted the outcome. He had given every indication, in public, of enthusiasm for the operation he had fought to stop. And he had been dragooned, his word. His bitter, rueful, perfectly chosen word for the feeling of being compelled into something against your will. What Eisenhower said to Churchill in those meetings was, in the end, very simple. He said, "This is the right thing to do militarily. I have the authority of the President and the combined chiefs behind me, and I am not going to change my mind." He said it in every form of the English language at his command. And then he was right, and Churchill was right. And history went ahead and did what history does, gave them both exactly enough to argue about for the rest of their lives. One question before you go. Do you think Churchill's Balkan strategy was genuine military vision, or was it always more about preserving British power than winning the war? I want to know where you stand. Drop it in the comments. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.